So before I get in too much into this video, I just want to make sure that I'm talking about this in a place that doesn't promote ill judgment or there are a lot of things in terms of the discussions of cozy horror that have caused a lot of people to have very high emotions and very I will say gatekeeping type activities within the horror community at large in terms of things. This video is not intended to do any kind of gatekeeping or anything like that. And even though you may hear me get very heated in certain discussions and portions of this video, this is not meant to do the kind of harm that the Mary Sue article did in terms of the discussion of cozy horror. I think there is a place in a space that we can collectively disagree on certain things in terms of orientation and the creation of certain elements in terms of things where they can be harmful to certain communities and things like that. But I think we need to take care that we're not conflating creative measures within an artistic piece as being as equating the mere existence of a creative community, taking away from other groups of real people who have the right to freedom of expression on a range of different topics, of different situations, of different things creatively, that we're not erasing specific voices in those communities, and trying to conflate the existence of a genre as being an erasure of those identities and communities and range of thoughts and ideas and expressions. So, and it's frustrating to me as someone who is a marginalized creator to see that kind of dialogue happening with respect to cozy horror, as someone who loves it and who has consumed media by it, who has written stories by it, and that sort of thing. So seeing those, even though I can see where certain perspectives have come from in terms of the expression of those frustrations and things like that, I want to do this video in a way that doesn't erase the genre that I feel so passionately about, while also not erasing the concerns and the very real traumas and things of what other people in the community have endured. So I want to make that as kind of an intro clarification to what this discussion is going to lend. I'm going to try to make it as lighthearted and fun and creatively stimulating as I can apart from that, but while also debunking a lot of stereotypes and even harmful accusations that have been going around the community that are actually hurtful to those of us who are creatives, who stand by cozy horror and who stand by the subgenre as something that can actually function and be included within the collective horror community as a whole. So I want to make that clear before I continue with this video, and then after that we shall see what happens. So let's keep going. So this is going to be a very interesting video to film in terms of the discussions that have been going on, but I'm going to try to make this video as both fun as well as informative. But it is frustrating to see some of the things that have been going on in terms of the discussions in this community and how it effectively shuts out a lot of different ideas and different things creatively within the community for things. So hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel. So today's video, aside from the new setup that you see here, by the time this video goes up I will have already posted my bookshelf organization video, at least the first one for this particular shelf, but you can see total different arrangement and it looks a little bit nicer and cleaner. So I'm happy about it, I'm excited about it, and it's just one of many bookshelf projects that I'm planning for the channel in terms of things to be able to showcase and share. But getting to the subject of this particular video, I'm going to start off with the story, or rather the scenario of a story, to kind of kick off this discussion that's in line with the last discussion video that I had. So, scenario video, a scenario of a story. So I'm going to start off with saying, let's imagine a character for this particular story who is in the business of baking. So when you're starting off this respective story, you see this kitchen, which is filled to the brim with all kinds of immaculate supplies, stainless steel appliances like the refrigerator, marble countertops, baking materials like mixing spoons and mixing bowls, and all these different immaculate items that you typically see in the kitchen when you're watching either a baking show or things like that. This particular story starts out with a reality show centered on a baker who is a puppet and controlled by like a really famous viral video puppet that is in the business of making bread. And you have a puppeteer who is very famous for their respective work in terms of commanding this puppet who is in the business of making all these kinds of bread. And you watch these scenarios in terms of where this character is baking this bread, and different types of bread like banana bread, chocolate chip bread, cinnamon raisin bread, and all the processes that happen with respect to baking this bread. And you feel like you're immersed in this respective story in this character because the puppet is charming, very sweet, very like lovable, like makes careful attention to all the different ingredients like the butter, like the flour, like the baking soda, mixing things into the bowl, watching the materials being mixed in the bowl, heating up the oven, things like that that evoke this sense of warmth and coziness and things like that that just pull you in and say, man, I really want to have some bread now because it's so appetizing and like alluring as you're watching this process being done by this alluring puppet who is watched by millions and millions of people in terms of things. But there's one specific episode in particular where things seem not as happy as you would think with that particular thing. So this puppet and therefore the puppeteer is putting on their regular show. They're starting to make their cinnamon raisin bread and have all the different materials lined up. And, you know, the puppet is cheerfully going back and forth saying, oh, I'm making the bread, tra-la-la-la, singing a song, and bringing you into like showcasing the different materials. But then you see something that is off about this puppet and thereby the puppeteer who's voicing the puppet in terms of what this particular episode is doing. You know that something's off, and the tone of your voice starts changing, and you're like, okay, what is going on here? It's like, you know, it seems a little ominous for some reason. And like, you know, this should be like a cozy cooking show that is enjoyable, but for all ages, and like, you know, getting into the materials and things like that, and seeing all this stuff happening, until you realize that behind the camera, with respect to this puppet and thereby the puppeteer putting on the show, that there is a very menacing presence behind the camera. And that is when you learn of what is hinging on this particular episode. And the puppeteer is trying desperately to stay in character, stay in tune, but the anxiety in his voice is becoming apparent as much as he's trying to say, la 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 la, baking the bread, and then getting more anxious as the episode goes on, until you realize that figure behind the character is none other than a death god who says, if your viewer subscriber count drops in any way during this respective performance, I will not only have ownership of your soul, but also the fact that you will be baking bread in the afterlife forever and ever and ever. And plot twist, you're not exactly sure if this is an episode that is in the afterlife of this puppeteer baking this bread, and he's summarily already failed and is reliving this respective scenario over and over again. So while this weighs on the puppeteer for making these shows and making these millions of views and not losing subscribers and things like that and viewership, you don't know whether or not the Grim Reaper has or the Death God has already taken his soul, and this is just a scenario that repeats over and over again. That is Baking the Bread, a cozy horror story by T.A. Summers. Huzzah! That's the best way that I can start this intro video on cozy horror, and we're going to talk about why I take this specific story and scenario of a story to talk about what cozy horror is. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So I'm the respective creator of this particular Baking the Bread cozy horror story. So I can only speak for myself when I would say that whether this particular story was in the means of a film, a short story, or a gaming environment when you're doing certain things like baking the bread and interacting with the puppeteer and that kind of thing, I would happily consume this story if it actually existed in terms of things. When I started constructing like ideas in terms of trying to present what my idea of a cozy horror story would be, I tried to incorporate it in the elements of this respective scenario to kind of give a general idea of what my intentions were with respect to creating it and how it aligns to what I think about when I'm consuming a cozy horror story. And so to kind of do an anatomical assessment of why this story would be cozy horror compared to maybe even being put into a different genre entirely, I first want to point out that in the beginning of the story, you're not 100% sure that this is a horror story. It brings you in to this feeling of this invitation of coziness with respect to the baking of different types of bread with the charming character of the puppet who is intended for all audiences, as well as the puppeteer who has that kind of charming demeanor that draws you into the respective story, not even in a false way, but at least like in terms of allowing you to get to know the character and and why they're charming and why they're alluring and why they have so much appeal. So that's the establishment of the character himself, both the puppet as well as the puppeteer, and you get the general introduction of that. You're not introduced to the stakes of the story quite yet, but you're kind of just getting to know the character as things go on. Where it becomes horror specifically is the specific scenario of that episode where the tone begins to change and you're not 100% sure what's going on beyond the change. And you can feel the sense of foreboding emanating from the character, whether it's from the tone of the puppeteer's voice, the mannerisms of the way the puppet moves around in terms of things, that you sense that something is off, and it's not told to you as the reader or the viewer or the consumer, but it's showcased in a way that you're saying, okay, something's going on. I don't know what's going on, but you feel this sense of foreboding and dread in terms of where it's going. And then it's when you start getting into the description of there's someone being behind the camera, that is the foreboding presence, and that there are stakes involved with respect to that story, is when the horror and the creeping element comes into play. And then when you learn of the presence of the death god, and that can be like in terms of the showcase of like, you know, the descriptions of the death god, the showcasing of things, the ominous, the darkness flowing through the room in contrast to the warmth and the sound, the warmth of the oven, the baking of the bread, the things that you would associate with coziness, that it comes in direct contrast to what the environment that you're you've come from and are going into. And then when you hear the stakes of what the death god has proposed to that particular puppeteer, and as well as what is in store of that, that's when it becomes horror. And then you also have the situation where like the plot twist comes into effect, where you don't know whether this is a scenario whether or not it is already in the afterlife, in the life of the puppeteer, and he's just repeating history as it goes forward, or whether this is the final countdown in terms of the story that's going on, that he's trying to save his life in terms of putting on the performance of his life, is where the horror element comes in. So mechanically speaking, I could definitely say that this would be an element of cozy horror, where it draws you in and then establishes the stakes, establishes the fear, creates the fear, and creates the fear in the character, and makes you aware of that, and have it in a situation that is very real, and a kind of a scenario of whether he's going to get out of it, or whether he's already into it and he can't get out of it. So that is my definition, using my very rudimentary story scenario to establish something that I think would fit in cozy horror, even though cozy horror does not have a set definition, and it even has some definitions that people don't think of depending on the medium that it is being portrayed as. But I hope that gives kind of a more clarifying aspect in terms of what I think of as cozy horror. That being said, this particular video is going to highlight specifically things that are not considered cozy horror, and I have three main scenarios in which I tried to debunk certain things about cozy horror that are not applicable in terms of some of the most common things that I've seen people try to discuss and debate on this. And so I hope that this video is both illuminating and also kind of gets you thinking creatively in terms of what cozy horror can be versus what it is not, and why attributing cozy horror as a label indiscriminately and towards stories that aren't applicable under that that term can be harmful in terms of the collective vision of what it is. Rather than thinking of cozy horror as a replacement for horror, it's just a certain segment that exists within it and can coexist within the horror genre. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. I probably could have told that story if even in a little bit more alluring of a format, to not give you the expectation of what to expect in terms of that particular story. But since this is a cozy horror video talking about the details of cozy horror and following up on the discussion that I have, I figured that all of you would probably already know that that particular story was not going to be very much in the vein of being as lighthearted of a story as it was portrayed out to be. So I kind of wanted to be transparent about it. But to talk about, I wanted to spend some time in this video talking about what cozy horror isn't, versus some of the most common misconceptions I have heard in the community when it came to discussions of it, because a lot of these really just, for something that has already kind of been within the community for things, as long as it has within under different names and under different things, there are a lot of things that conceptually that a lot of people don't think about working with respect to the mechanism of cozy horror, comparatively speaking, within the as juxtaposed to the collective horror genre. So what I wanted to do is kind of like give you a lighthearted story to think about, and how this respective story would be considered cozy horror, it within delineations of what the term of cozy juxtaposed to horror and how those two would function together. So let's first talk about what cozy horror is not. And I'm going to give three specific things to think about when you're talking about cozy horror in terms of what it isn't. First of all, cozy horror is not a new term. So the thing that a lot of people have been trying to say is that it's a new thing that people have just come up with, that it's riding the coattails of a lot of things that have happened in other genres, including cozy mysteries or cozy sci-fi stories or things like that, or cozy fantasy stories, when really that's not exactly true in terms of stuff. Cozy horror has been something that, even if people have not been quick to define what it is, like in terms of it having cross genre and cross category appeal, it's not necessarily something that has been in the community for a brief amount of time. And I mentioned this in the previous video as well, in terms of like I've heard the term even dating back into 2016 and things like that within even the gaming community and things like that. But it's actually even older than that, based on cursory searches that I have seen in terms of things. Like the earliest article that I have been able to find that referenced specifically cozy horror, and I'll link it in the description before, was all the way back in 2009, and it was describing a set of films that were within the horror community and within the film community, and describing the specific filming production company that is British and that was formed back in 1934, and this was called Hammer Films. And Hammer Films produced a lot of gothic and fantasy horror films between the years of the 1950s to the 1970s. And that particular article mentions cozy, what they define as cozy horror, and that. So that's kind of synonymous with how cozy horror has come to be equated with quiet horror, in the sense that it is referencing more fantasy horror films, as well as like monster movies and things like that, and gothic horror films in terms of like the gothic setting and things like that. But even then, that particular article doesn't necessarily have a clear definition of what they established to be cozy horror in terms of the delineation of those specific types of films, because they're really juxtaposing the term of cozy horror with the rise of films in the 1980s that were directed in the orientation of more slasher, or things that were on screen that were meant to shock and be in the face of viewers within the horror genre. So I want to make it clear that cozy horror itself is not a new term, but I think the lack of definition and the way that different communities have put specific terms to the references of cozy horror has contributed to its people not really understanding like what it entails, or it having a specific definition apart from certain intercommunity terms, in terms of depending on what medium you're talking about, whether it's film, whether it's gaming, or things like that. What it seems like in terms of what cozy horror has been in previous ventures to be defined as, is being juxtaposed to the general things that people think about when it comes to horror, and attributing that to being more in your face, continuous thrills, chills, and things like that. So I think that contributes to some of the pushback against cozy horror as a term, because it lacks that grounding of other of other subgenres within different genres of media that give it that particular definition. So what I will say is that cozy horror is not a new term. It just has not had some of the definitive identifying points because it's had different meanings with respect to the different mediums that it has been attributed to. Second thing that I want to talk about in terms of what cozy horror is not is that this is not um, a replacement for horror as a whole. It is just one piece of the larger puzzle that is horror. So I've heard so many people misattribute the term of cozy horror as a thing to devalue or take away from the definition of horror. And I'll get into the definitions of horror in a little bit and juxtapose like the definition of cozy among other things with that to kind of showcase why that's not true. But something that I want to point out is that for cozy horror, you can think of it as being one, and I forgot the name of the person who had said this because when she was talking about how romance has different levels to it in terms of steam factor, in terms of intensity factor, and things like that, it was a very solid argument in terms of defending why cozy horror is really just one piece of the larger horror puzzle because when you think about it in terms of people who have equated cozy horror to low stakes horror or other types of horror that isn't in your face, you have to look at it from the perspective of seeing that horror has a range of different thrills, chills, scares, things like that, things that evoke some of the same emotions but in different ways. So I want to point out specifically that a lot of what people have been saying about it being a replacement for horror as a collective genre is just not true at all. And I know that there have been people who, in ill faith, have been trying to co-opt the term of cozy horror as a way to erase the contributions of marginalized communities and things like that in an attempt to redefine and to take away from the stories that are more intense, more in your face, that deal with heavy and difficult subjects in terms of things. But the existence of cozy horror and the fans of people who have been following cozy horror for the longest time in terms of things, they are not trying to erase horror as a genre. If anything, they are a part of the community and they can like different ranges within the community of horror. I think it is important to be inclusive of people who have different voices and different contributions and different types of stories to include in the collective menagerie of what horror is. And so when I see this kind of gatekeeping in terms of people saying, oh, so what, and I see people try to argue that cozy horror is somehow taking away from marginalized communities who try to look into more difficult subject matters and somehow censor or dilute the experience that is horror. It's horrifying to me that there's this sense of erasure that is going on in terms of not considering that cozy horror is just one piece of the pie rather than trying to eclipse the entire pie itself. Like if anything, like I think the way that we need to think about it in terms of on things is with respect to that centerpiece of thinking that horror has different levels of intensity and embrace the elements of what it can bring to the community and what it has already brought to the community because it's already been here, even if it's not in as noted in literature specifically for specific elements and things like that. And I'll get into where this is more relevant in my third point. But it's the way that we tell our stories. It is like if you have like a specific definition for a genre, like the genre that is horror, we have to be able to think about it existing in a way where those elements are still present, but and not in the sense of being diluted, but the fact that there are levels and ranges within that definition. So I want to make that clear, and try to deflect, try to take from that argument that somehow cozy horror is a threat to the telling of horror stories of different intensity levels. Because if like, you can have as much intensity and a heaviness within the horror genre as you would like to have, and be able to consider that in different veins and different tones, but it doesn't take away that the fact that the elements are still there, that the elements are still present to make it horror. So I want to make sure, like, even in the story that I told at the beginning of this respective video, you start getting the pieces of where the horror component comes in, aside from the cozy elements of the baking of the bread and everything else and stuff like that, and the puppet, and like the kind atmosphere that it invites you into before it gets to the point where it becomes more sinister and creepy and you're not exactly sure where it's going to go. Kind of like an episode of Black Mirror where things hit the fan very quickly and it's not as things are not what they seem. But I want to emphasize that cozy horror can have that kind of element where it draws you into its respective narrative with something that is within the definition of cozy, while also retaining some of the not just some of the elements, but the same elements of what horror stories encompass. Which leads me to my third point. I cannot stress this third point enough. Cozy horror is not a contradiction. Cozy horror is not a contradiction. There are two elements that are not as diametrically opposed as you might think. I have seen this in the collective community frequently cited and completely and utterly missing the mark. And let me explain why. Because a lot of people are conflating the sense of, like, I almost want to say that there may be people who are conflating the definition of horror with thriller. And I want to take a moment to kind of read off like some of the definitions of these to kind of explain my point a little bit and why it's not a contradiction. So first of all, let's look at the definition of cozy as kind of paraphrased from the Oxford definition. It is giving a feeling of warmth or complacency or comfort, or it's a feeling of comfort, warmth, and relaxation. So that's the definition of cozy. The definition of horror is an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. There is nothing saying in the definition of horror that those elements have to be continuous throughout that story. They simply have to be there in order to make it horror. And likewise with cozy, there is nothing saying that there isn't that feeling of warmth or complacency or comfort is continuously through that story. It simply has to be present. And so both of those elements can be within the same story depending on how you articulate that particular story to make something a cozy horror. Now, let me give you the definition of a thriller. I would almost be a little bit more challenging of the idea of someone writing a cozy thriller, because now those two definitions are specifically opposed to each other. So the definition of a thriller is the fact that a thriller is meant to evoke a specific feeling of being on the edge of your seat throughout a story. And a lot of people like, there are a lot of stories that are considered thrillers that are horror. There are a lot of thrillers that are there are a lot of horror stories that are considered thrillers, but they are not necessarily the same thing. They can work in conjunction with each other. And like, the thing about thrillers is that it can apply to multiple subgenres in terms of things. It's a genre that can cross different ones to make the elements of the stories that are being told fit that definition of thriller. But horror is not necessarily the same as what a thrill in terms of the mechanization of it, for what thriller is defined by. Horror is evoking an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust, and it can be either in an isolated part of the story or encompassing the whole part of the story. And how you choose that intensity can make it for what it is in terms of what you're doing for specific stories. I want to make that abundantly clear and make sure that people are not are realizing that they're not misattributing the definitions of these or the mechanizations of what happens in horror stories in terms of what it can evoke. And also being said, with respect to cozy horror, it's not a contradiction in the same way that you can think of what we think of as in the pain of nostalgia. Like, when you think of something that's nostalgia, it is evoking something that you are familiar with from a time like that is associated with you, that is no longer there anymore, and you feel hurt or a sense of grief with the absence of it. There's nothing saying that a cozy horror story can't bring you into that sense of familiar coziness, comfort in the environment that it chooses to evoke, and still thrill and chill and scare you and make you feel uncomfortable, even while still drawing you into the story to make you want to follow it and see what happens, and feel, and giving that sense of fear within that with while juxtaposed with a sense of wonder while feeling that fear. And the best way that I can describe this, I don't like, I'm trying to make it such in a way where I explain it to people that there's nothing saying that you can't feel fear from something that is familiar to you, or something that brings you comfort, where you feel uncomfortable in the presence of something that is supposed to be or intentionally trying to be comforting, or feel comfort in that sense of discomfort. So the best way that I can say this, in the story that I referenced to in the beginning of this video, is that when you're starting off looking at the different comforting elements of the story that it is bringing you in and that's enticing you, you're feeling the sense of different emotions in terms of seeing the puppeteer who is on this cooking show and making the bread, and all these different elements that are designed to bring you into that feeling of coziness and comfort because of what you're seeing from what it's choosing to evoke. But then you see the other elements of fear and the shift of tone and things. Whilst it's still being comforting, there's a feeling of fear that's underlying that comfort for it. So I think that's the best way that I can actually describe it, to kind of start off this conversation about why cozy horror in itself cannot be a contradiction in and of itself. It is dependent upon how you choose to execute those story elements. Disingenuous to try to write off the juxtaposition of those two elements and say that they can't exist when they absolutely can. So I think that that's kind of where I'm starting off this respective conversation in terms of the three elements of what cozy horror is not, and kind of what to think about in terms of the construction of what a story can be when it's written in cozy horror. And I think there are definitely more conversations that I want to have on this to make it more clear to people to say that this is a legitimate subgenre that can add a lot to the horror community at large, while also not being contradictory or trying to overshadow other stories that are told within horror that that erase the efforts of those who write more intense stories, as opposed to those who that are less intense but they still evoke some of the same emotions and fear and elements of the horror genre. So that's where I will leave it. And I'm probably just going to end the video here to start off this conversation and expand more as time continues to make these elements more clear and to give cozy horror a little bit more of a boost in terms of seeing how it can work and how people can use it and have it be a part of the community, especially as someone who has a love of cozy horror stories, whether it's those that I consume, that I play through in the gaming community, that I want to see from other authors who are trying to write those stories and market those stories, and also just having a love for it in general, speaking in terms of things. I don't want it to be a where it feels like it's overshadowing, or where it feels like it's talking over the voices of other people who choose to write other stories in the vein of horror. And here's the thing that also kind of drives me off the wall with some of the comments that I've heard in the community, because it seems like, you know, with this talk of replacement and not being, and readers not being able to handle certain topics and things like that, and that and wanting certain things from the community, I feel like there is a lot of judgment that is being passed in terms of instead of being embracing of these different elements and these different things that may seem diametrically opposed. Like, you can have things that you can have different, you can have an appreciation of different levels of storytelling without dismissing what the work of the people who are doing those different levels of storytelling. So I want to make that abundantly clear and give an inclusive element to this discussion rather than just completely knocking it to the side. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be informed of when I post new videos to the channel. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video. And I hope to have more video discussions of this.